The timestamp reads November 8th, 1952, 14:23 hours, somewhere over the Chongchon River, altitude 28,000 feet. The gun camera film runs for 11 seconds. That's all. 11 seconds of 16mm footage from the nose of an F-86 Sabre, and in every single frame, a MiG-15 fills the gunsight. The Soviet-built fighter rolls right. The Pipper follows. It rolls left, hard, pulling vapor off the wingtips. The Pipper follows. The MiG's pilot throws everything he has into a descending brake, a move that should have worked, a move that had worked against P-80s and F-80s and Meteors, a move Soviet instructors taught as doctrine. The Pipper stays centered. 6 M3. Browning machine guns open up at 400 yards, and the MiG comes apart in pieces. 11 seconds. The pilot who shot that footage, Captain Leonard Lilley of the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing, logged the kill and landed at Suwon with enough fuel for maybe 8 more minutes of flight. His debrief runs 2 pages. Dry, technical, no drama. He describes the MiG's evasive pattern as aggressive but predictable. Those 3 words sit at the center of everything that follows in this story. If this kind of detail hooks you the way it hooks me, hit subscribe and drop a like so more people find it. Leave a comment if you know a Sabre pilot's name or a MiG pilot's. History remembers the airplanes. It should remember the men. Share this with someone who cares about what happened over Korea. The gun camera footage circulated through 5th Air Force intelligence within 48 hours. Analysts at Kimpo flagged it, not because the kill itself stood out. Sabres had been killing MiGs since December of 1950. But because of what the MiG didn't do. It didn't run. MiG-15s held a raw climb rate advantage over the F-86, something on the order of 3,000 feet per minute versus the Sabre's 2,400. A MiG pilot in trouble had one reliable escape: pull the nose vertical, light the afterburner, and go where the Sabre couldn't follow. Soviet tactical manuals called this the zoom exit. It worked almost every time. This MiG didn't zoom. It fought. The intelligence summary uses the phrase uncharacteristic engagement profile. Their phrase. And that phrase triggered a review of 37 separate gun camera films from October and November of 1952, all from the 51st and 4th Fighter Interceptor Wings. The pattern held across dozens of engagements. MiG pilots along the Yalu had started standing and fighting instead of slashing through American formations and climbing away. They rolled hard, they broke into their attackers, they pulled lead reversals and tried to outmaneuver F-86s in the horizontal plane. They died doing it. The kill ratio for those 2 months spiked. 5th Air Force recorded it at better than 7-1. Something fundamental had changed in MiG Alley, and the American analysts at Kimpo and Itazuke knew it, even if they couldn't yet explain what drove the shift. The MiG-15 remained a serious airplane, fast, well-armed, with 2 23mm cannon and a single 37mm capable of reaching 50,000 feet. On paper, it matched or exceeded the Sabre in almost every vertical performance category. But the gun camera told a different story than the spec sheet. Captain Lilley's 11 seconds of film showed a fighter that could climb like nothing else in the sky, choosing instead to turn. Choosing the F-86's game and choosing wrong. Why did MiG pilots stop running? What changed in the fall of 1952 that made experienced Soviet and Chinese aviators abandon their best tactic and adopt their worst? The answer cuts through 60 years of mythology about MiG Alley and lands on something painfully specific. A combination of aerodynamics, hydraulics, and the 0.6 of a second that separated life from death at Mach 0.9. We can't fight these things. That assessment came from a B-29 pilot over Sinwiju in November of 1950, after MiG-15s tore through a formation of superfortresses and shot down 3 in under 4 minutes. The crews that survived described an aircraft they couldn't process. Swept wings, no propeller, climbing at angles that looked vertical. One tail gunner reported a silver blur that crossed his field of view so fast he never got his guns tracking. The panic spread upward through Far East Air Force's command in a matter of days. Nothing in the theater inventory could touch the MiG at altitude. The F-80 Shooting Star topped out around 580 miles per hour in level flight and ran out of useful performance above 40,000 feet. The F-84 Thunderjet fared slightly better, but carried the aerodynamic profile of a pipe fitting. The Navy's F-9F Panther, straight-winged, underpowered, belonged to a different generation of aircraft entirely. The MiG-15 belonged to the future. Artem Mikoyan's design bureau had built an interceptor around a single Klimov VK-1 engine, itself reverse-engineered from the Rolls-Royce Nenni, which the British had sold to the Soviets in 1947. That engine produced 5,900 pounds of thrust, enough to push the MiG past 660 miles per hour at sea level. The airframe weighed just 8,450 pounds empty. Thin swept wings at 35 degrees gave it high subsonic agility and a service ceiling above 50,000 feet. The armament bordered on absurd. 2 NR-23 cannon packed into the lower fuselage alongside a single N-37, all three mounted on a drop-down tray for ground servicing. A 1-second burst from that combination threw roughly 14 pounds of high-explosive shells at a target. One good hit from the 37 could fold a B-29's wing spar. American pilots felt the concussive thump of those cannon rounds detonating nearby, a physical shock through the airframe, distinct from machine gun strikes, more like someone hitting the fuselage with a sledgehammer. You didn't wonder whether a 37mm shell had missed close. You knew. By December of 1950, 5th Air Force had rushed F-86 Sabres to Korea, specifically to counter the MiG threat. The 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing deployed to Kimpo with 3 squadrons, and within weeks the air picture stabilized. But the narrative had already calcified. The MiG-15 had gotten there first and owned the sky, and American aviation press treated the Sabre as a response, an answer, not a superior. Aviation Week ran assessments through 1951 calling the MiG arguably the finest fighter in the world. Western attachés in Moscow reinforced the mystique. The aircraft looked right, climbed right, and killed bombers with terrifying efficiency. So, the assumption hardened. The MiG-15 held the edge, and American pilots compensated with training and tactics. The assumption contained a critical error, one buried in the hydraulic lines running from the MiG's cockpit to its control surfaces. The cold at Kimpo hit you in the teeth. December 1950, tarmac temperature hovering around 5 below zero, wind cutting across the Han River flats with nothing to stop it. Ground crews from the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing worked bare-handed on the Sabres because heavy gloves made it impossible to safety wire the gun bay panels. Frostbite cases outnumbered combat injuries that first week. The F-86s arrived in theater looking inadequate on paper. Lower service ceiling than the MiG 49,000 feet versus 51,000. Slower climb rate by a margin that mattered. Heavier by nearly 2,000 pounds empty. The Sabre carried 6 50-caliber machine guns against the MiG's cannon, which meant an American pilot needed sustained hits where a Soviet pilot needed one lucky round. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton, who scored the first Sabre versus MiG kill on December 17th, described the firepower gap bluntly. We had to hose them. They just had to touch us. So, what did the Sabre actually bring to MiG Alley? North American aviation had designed the F-86 around a different philosophy than the MiG-15. The Soviet aircraft existed to kill bombers, to climb fast, slash through a formation, and get out. Every design choice served that mission. The Sabre existed to kill fighters. The difference showed up in the wing profile, the cockpit layout, and, above all, in one critical system that North Americans' engineers had gotten exactly right. The wing told part of the story. Both aircraft used 35-degree sweep, but North American had incorporated automatic leading-edge slats, devices that deployed at high angles of attack to delay aerodynamic stall. The MiG had fixed leading edges. At cruise speed, the difference meant nothing. In a hard turn at Mach 0.85, pulling 4 or 5 Gs, the difference meant the Sabre kept flying, while the MiG's wing started buffeting toward departure. The radar gun sight told another part. North American fitted the A1CM ranging radar behind the upper lip of the intake, feeding computed lead angles to the pilot's gunsight reticle. A Sabre pilot didn't estimate deflection the way his father had in a P-51. The sight did the trigonometry. Average marksmen became consistent killers at ranges and crossing angles that would have produced misses from any manually tracked pipper. But the real advantage, the one that broke the MiG-15's reputation and its pilots, sat behind the instrument panel, connected to push-pull rods running back through the fuselage to the tail. The flight control system. The thing the Soviets got catastrophically wrong. The MiG-15's controls tried to kill its own pilots above Mach 0.82. That's not metaphor. The aircraft used manually boosted ailerons and a mechanically linked elevator with no hydraulic assistance. At low speed, the setup felt fine. Light, responsive, honest. Soviet test pilots praised the handling. But aerodynamic forces on control surfaces increase with the square of airspeed, and at transonic velocities, those forces became savage. A MiG pilot pulling into a hard turn at Mach 0.86 had to haul on the stick with both hands, fighting 60, 70, 80 pounds of back pressure just to hold 4 Gs. His arms burned, his grip weakened. 0.6 of a second into the pull, the nose wandered because human muscle couldn't sustain the load with precision. The Sabre's stick required 11 pounds for the same maneuver. North American had installed a hydraulic boost system in the F-86's flight controls. Not full power assisted, not fly-by-wire, but a force multiplier that bled the aerodynamic loads down to manageable levels across the entire speed envelope. A Sabre pilot at Mach 0.9 could make fine corrections with his fingertips. Roll rate stayed consistent while pitch authority remained linear. The aircraft did what the pilot's hands told it to do instantly, at any speed the airframe could survive. The Soviets knew about hydraulic boost. They chose not to use it. The engineering records from the Mikoyan Bureau cite concerns about combat damage. A hydraulic line severed by gunfire would leave the pilot with a dead stick and no mechanical reversion. The reasoning made sense on paper. In practice, it meant every MiG-15 in Korea flew with a control system designed for 1945 performance envelopes strapped to a 1950 airframe pushing past 600 knots. Soviet engineers had built a jet that could reach speeds where its own pilot lost the ability to fight it. How much did this matter in combat? The after-action reports answer that question with body counts. A MiG pilot entering a turning fight against a Sabre faced a compounding problem. He pulled hard, the stick forces climbed, his tracking precision degraded, and his opponent, pulling the same G in the same speed range, tracked him smoothly with a computing gunsight and fingertip control authority. The MiG pilot didn't just lose the geometry, he lost the ability to change it. Then there's what the Sabre pilot wore. The David Clark Company's G-suit, a 5-bladder pressure garment covering the legs and abdomen, inflated automatically during high G maneuvering, squeezing blood back toward the brain and buying roughly 1.5 additional Gs of tolerance before gray out. Soviet pilots in Korea flew without G-suits until mid-1952. A Sabre pilot could sustain a 6G turn and keep his vision sharp. His Soviet counterpart grayed out at 4.5, maybe 5. The margins sound small until you realize that a half-G advantage in sustained turn rate translates to roughly 3 degrees per second of angular gain, enough to move from defensive to guns tracking in under 8 seconds of hard maneuvering. The British learned a version of this lesson over Port Said during the Suez Crisis of 1956, when Egyptian Air Force pilots flying MiG-15s refused to engage Hawker Hunters above 500 knots. Same aircraft, same control deficiency, different war. But that confirms the pattern rather than complicating it. Stack these edges together. Hydraulic boost gave the Sabre pilot precision where the MiG pilot had brute force muscle fatigue. The G-suit gave him consciousness where the MiG pilot had tunnel vision. The A1CM radar gunsight gave him computed firing solutions where the MiG pilot had estimation and prayer. You wouldn't find any of this in a Jane's listing or in the speed-altitude climb charts that Aviation Week published. A defense correspondent in 1951 comparing the two aircraft on published specifications would have called the MiG-15 superior, and he would have been dead wrong. The spec sheet measured the airplane. Combat measured the system, airframe, engine, cockpit, ergonomics, life support, fire control, and the 206 bones holding the stick. The Americans built a system. The Soviets built an airplane. Captain Frederick Boots Blesse logged over 1,000 flight hours before he ever crossed the Yalu. His Soviet counterparts in the 324th Fighter Aviation Division averaged between 150 and 200. The Chinese pilots rotating through Antung had even less, sometimes under 100 hours total, fewer than 40 in the MiG-15 itself. That gap killed more pilots than any cannon round. Why did the disparity exist? Money, partly. The United States Air Force in 1951 spent more on aviation fuel for training commands than the entire Soviet Air Force budget allocated to pilot development. But the deeper cause ran through doctrine. Soviet fighter training emphasized ground-controlled intercept profiles, climb to assigned altitude, turn to assigned heading, attack assigned target, return to base. The controller made decisions. The pilot executed them. American training at Nellis and Williams emphasized individual tactical judgment and energy management, plus fluid two-ship coordination, where the wingman thought independently rather than following orders relayed from a radar scope 40 miles behind the front. The Israelis discovered the same asymmetry during the War of Attrition in 1969 and 1970, when Israeli Air Force pilots with 600-plus hours routinely outmaneuvered Egyptian pilots flying newer MiG-21s with half that training time. Soviet advisors in Cairo filed reports blaming Egyptian cultural factors. The actual problem sat in the syllabus. But that's beside the point. What mattered over MiG Alley came down to the first 3 seconds of an engagement. A Sabre pilot with 800 hours had seen enough dogfight geometry, in training, in mirror image practice fights against squadron mates, to recognize a developing situation before it fully developed. He didn't process the tactical picture consciously. His hands moved. A Chinese pilot with 90 hours of flight time saw the same geometry and froze for a half second, maybe a full second, running through memorized procedures from a ground school classroom in Manchuria. 1 second at Mach 0.85 covers 460 feet. The records from the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, the elite Soviet unit that provided the backbone of MiG operations through 1951 and early 52, show a kill ratio against Sabres of roughly 1-to-1. Competent pilots with adequate hours flying the same aircraft produced dramatically different results than the Chinese and North Korean units that replaced them. When the Soviets rotated experienced regiments home and backfilled with fresh Chinese graduates, Sabre kill ratios climbed from 3-to-1 past 7-to-1 in a matter of weeks. The hardware hadn't changed. The hands on the stick had. The vibration started in the rudder pedals, a low-frequency buzz that climbed through the airframe and settled in the pilot's molars as the MiG-15 pushed past Mach 0.84 in a diving left turn over the Chongchon River. Lieutenant Semyon Fedorets of the 196th Fighter Aviation Regiment felt it on the morning of October 3, 1952, somewhere between 28,000 and 24,000 feet, accelerating through a turn he'd entered voluntarily and couldn't now control. He'd bounced a pair of Sabres from the 39th Fighter Interceptor Squadron near the mouth of the Yalu, diving out of a 4-ship formation at 41,000 feet with the sun behind him. Textbook Soviet tactics: altitude advantage, speed built in the dive, 1 firing pass, then zoom climb back to sanctuary above 45,000. Fedorets had done this dozens of times. The 37mm cannon in the MiG's belly needed only a single hit to shatter a Sabre's wing spar, and the geometry looked clean. But the lead Sabre, flown by First Lieutenant James Jabara's wingman, Captain Kenneth Chandler, broke hard right at the last moment, pulling into Fedorets' flight path and forcing a crossing shot that went wide. Fedorets overshot. Now he carried Mach 0.86 in a left-hand reversal, trying to reacquire. The stick froze, not gradually. The aerodynamic loads on the MiG's elevator and ailerons crossed the threshold where human arms stopped being adequate actuators. Fedorets hauled back with both hands wrapped around the grip, forearms locked, shoulders burning. The nose tracked maybe 2 degrees per second in pitch. He needed 8 to stay in the fight. Above him and behind, Chandler rolled wings level, pulled 4Gs with 11 pounds of stick force, and slid into a quartering attack from Fedorets' 5 o'clock high. What happened next took 6 seconds. Chandler's a 1 cm gunsight computed the lead angle as Fedorets' MiG wallowed through its turn. The radar ranged the target at 1,200 feet and closing. Chandler pressed the trigger at 900 feet, and the 650 calibers delivered a concentrated burst that walked from the MiG's left wing root across the fuselage spine and into the base of the vertical stabilizer. Fedorets' aircraft pitched up violently, the damaged tail structure altering the aerodynamic balance, and entered a flat spin at 22,000 feet over the river bend west of Sinuiju. Fedorets ejected. The Soviet records confirm his survival, though he never flew combat again. Sources conflict on whether the spinal compression injuries came from the ejection or the spin itself. Chandler's gun camera footage survived. The film shows something the kill tallies never captured: the MiG's wings rocking in the final 2 seconds before impact, the aircraft making small, desperate corrections that looked like a pilot fighting his own machine rather than his enemy. The Sabre behind him tracked smooth as a turret, 2 aircraft in the same cubic mile of sky experiencing fundamentally different wars. That engagement replayed itself across MiG Alley through the fall of 1952 with variations in altitude, angle, and outcome, but almost never in the underlying mechanism. MiG pilots entered fights with every advantage the aircraft's raw performance could give them: ceiling, climb rate, acceleration above 30,000 feet. They lost those advantages the moment the airspeed indicator touched Mach 0.86 and the controls turned to concrete. Every pursuit curve that took a MiG below 30,000 feet and above 500 knots funneled its pilot into a regime where the Sabre owned the sky. The Soviet tactical response made the problem worse. Ground controllers at Antung, watching the losses mount, ordered MiG formations to engage more aggressively rather than maintain the slashing hit-and-run profiles that had worked in 1951. The logic seemed sound. If Sabres dominated the turning fight at high transonic speeds, then perhaps closing to point-blank range in a diving attack would eliminate the need to maneuver. Instead, the diving attacks built exactly the speed that crippled the MiG's controls, and pilots who missed on the first pass found themselves deep in the Sabre's envelope with stiff ailerons, heavy elevators, and an American on their tail whose stick felt like it weighed nothing. Captain Chandler scored 2 more kills before his tour ended in January of 1953. Both followed the same pattern. High-speed intercept gone wrong for the MiG pilot, reversal attempt above Mach 0.85, controls stiffening, tracking solution collapsing, and a Sabre sliding into firing position with mechanical patience. Chandler described the sensation of pursuing a MiG in that speed range as chasing a car with no power steering through a parking lot. The MiG could go fast, it just couldn't go anywhere. 4 rounds hit the MiG's fuselage before Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Oskin understood he'd been tracking the wrong Sabre. February 19, 1953. 11:40 a.m. over the frozen bend of the Chongchon, 26,000 feet, temperature outside the canopy somewhere around -40. Oskin had committed to a head-on pass against an F-86 from the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing and pulled into a climbing left turn to re-engage. His eyes locked onto the Sabre rolling out below him. He never saw the second one, First Lieutenant Harold Fisher, call sign Eagle Lead, slide into his deep 6 from a split S entry that put Fisher 1,200 feet behind and 50 feet below the MiG's jet wash. Fisher's A1 cm gunsight locked the range. The Pipper drifted onto the MiG's tailpipe and stabilized. Fisher squeezed the trigger for a 2-second burst that sent roughly 160 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary into a convergence zone the size of a kitchen table. The impact felt like hail on a tin roof, Oskin's description, recorded in a post-war Soviet interview. Metallic hammering through the seat pan and spine, rattling his helmet. The instrument panel lighting flickered. The VK-1 engine's thrust dropped by a third as fragments perforated the combustion chamber casing. Oskin shoved the stick forward and right, trying to break into a diving spiral that might open the range. The stick moved. The aircraft barely responded. At Mach 0.87 in damaged condition, the MiG's already marginal control authority had degraded to almost nothing. So, what options did a MiG pilot have once a Sabre locked into firing position at high transonic speed? Roll away. The MiG's aileron forces at Mach 0.85 exceeded 50 pounds of lateral stick displacement. A full authority roll reversal took between 3 and 4 seconds. The Sabre matched it in 1.5 with hydraulic boost doing the work. By the time the MiG completed its reversal, the Sabre had already repositioned inside the new turn. Dive and accelerate. The MiG could outrun the Sabre in a clean dive below 20,000 feet. The Klimov engine's thrust advantage at lower altitudes gave it an edge in straight-line acceleration. But diving meant building more speed, which meant heavier controls, which meant the pilot couldn't pull out of the dive with any precision. Several MiG pilots in the winter of 52 through 53 rode their aircraft into the hills north of Sinuiju, trying exactly this escape. The terrain didn't care about thrust-to-weight ratios, chop throttle, and force an overshoot. This worked against manually aimed guns. Against a radar-ranging computing gunsight that continuously updated the firing solution, decelerating just gave the Sabre pilot a slower, larger target with a longer tracking window. The math ran backward. Oskin tried the dive. Fisher followed, holding 1,200 feet of separation, letting the gunsight compute while the MiG's damaged engine trailed a thin ribbon of gray smoke that made tracking effortless. At 18,000 feet, Fisher fired again. A 3-second burst that struck the MiG's left wing at the root, severing hydraulic lines to the landing gear and shredding the aileron bell crank. The MiG snapped left and entered an inverted spiral. Oskin ejected at 14,000 feet over Chinese-held territory and survived with frostbite on both hands and a fractured vertebra. Fisher's total engagement time from first trigger squeeze to Oskin's ejection ran 41 seconds. 41 seconds from the moment the Sabre settled into firing position to the moment the MiG ceased to exist as a flying machine. The gun camera film shows Fisher making 2 minor stick corrections during the entire pursuit. 2. The gun sight held the solution. The hydraulic controls held the tracking. Fisher's job reduced to throttle management and trigger discipline. That ratio, 41 seconds, 2 corrections, tells you everything the kill statistics obscure. Once a Sabre pilot reached a stabilized firing position behind a MiG-15 at combat speed, the engagement stopped being a contest. The MiG couldn't roll fast enough to break the tracking, couldn't dive without losing what little control authority remained, and couldn't decelerate without handing the Sabre a gift. Every escape route fed back into the same disadvantage. Fisher had flown himself into a position where the aircraft and its systems did the killing for him, and Oskin, a competent pilot with over 300 hours in type, had no mechanical answer left to give. 792. That's how many MiG-15s the United States Air Force claimed destroyed in air-to-air combat over Korea. Against 78 Sabres lost, a ratio of 10-1. The Soviets published nothing. The loss records from the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps stayed sealed through Stalin's death, through the thaw under Khrushchev, through decades of silence, locked in the central archive of the Ministry of Defense in Podolsk until 1993, when Russian military historians finally pried open the files. What they found landed somewhere between the American claims and the silence that had preceded them. 335 MiG-15s lost to all causes, including accidents, ground fire, and air combat with non-Sabre types. Against Sabres specifically, the documented losses came to approximately 220. The Soviet records credited their own pilots with 170 Sabre kills, so the real ratio sat closer to 3-1. Still devastating. Still a systemic indictment of everything the MiG-15 asked its pilots to do above Mach 0.82. But what about that American claim of 792? Gun camera film accounted for a fraction of the confirmations. Most kills received validation through wingman testimony and post-mission debriefs. standard practice across every air force in every war, and reliably inflated by a factor of 2 to 3. The Air Force knew this. A classified internal review conducted at Wright-Patterson in 1955 used the word optimistic to describe the confirmation methodology. Their word. The Soviet number of 170 Sabre kills carries its own distortion. Pilots who lost their wingmen over the Yellow Sea had no witnesses. Aircraft that limped back to Kimpo with shattered hydraulic lines and collapsed landing gear counted as damaged in American records, not losses. But the MiG pilot who put those rounds into the fuselage saw an aircraft trailing smoke and pitched nose down, and he reported a kill. Overcounting happened on both sides, and so did undercounting. The fog cuts in every direction. Strip away the inflation on both sides, and the archival consensus among Russian and American researchers converges around a ratio between 2.5 and 4 to 1 in the Sabre's favor. Call it 3. 3 MiG-15s fell for every Sabre lost in air-to-air combat over the 37 months of the Korean Air War. 3 to 1 against an aircraft that climbed faster, flew higher, turned tighter, and accelerated harder above 30,000 feet. How do you lose 3 to 1 in a superior airplane? You lose it in the stick, you lose it in the gunsight, you lose it in the 900 hours of training, differential between the pilot squeezing the trigger and the pilot trying to break the track. You lose it at Mach 0.86 when your elevator requires 60 pounds of force and his requires 11. You lose it in the half-second freeze while your hands search for a response your aircraft can't physically deliver. Captain Nikolai Ivanov of the 523rd Fighter Aviation Regiment flew his last sortie on March 22, 1953, at 9:12 a.m. over the Suiho Reservoir. He took a burst of 50 caliber fire through the cockpit at 23,000 feet from an F-86 he apparently never saw. The canopy fragmented inward. Ivanov died strapped to his ejection seat at 470 knots, hands still locked on a control stick that had stopped answering him 2 seconds before the bullets arrived. He had 211 flight hours. The Sabre pilot behind him had 840. The ratio between those two numbers, roughly 4 to 1, mirrors the kill ratio almost exactly. The Soviets never published that correlation either. The MiG-15 had the better spec sheet. It lost anyway. Every number favored the Soviet aircraft: ceiling, climb rate, thrust to weight, instantaneous turn performance above 25,000 feet. On paper, the F-86 Sabre looked like a concession. Heavier, slower to climb, lower service ceiling by nearly 8,000 feet. North Americans' engineers read those comparisons and shrugged. They'd built something the specifications couldn't measure. The Americans integrated the system: pilot, airframe, gunsight, controls, training pipeline, each component designed to amplify the others. The A1CM radar ranging sight meant nothing without hydraulic controls smooth enough to hold a tracking solution. Those controls, in turn, only mattered if the pilot had 800 hours and could fly the geometry that put him in firing position. And all that training collapsed without an aircraft that responded at Mach 0.9 the same way it responded at Mach 0.4. Every piece fed the next. Remove one, and the chain broke. The Soviets removed 3. The F-100 Super Sabre inherited the hydraulic flight control architecture. So did the F-104. The F-4 Phantom carried a descendant of the A1CM computing site married to radar-guided missiles. The F-15 Eagle, the air superiority fighter that replaced the Phantom 2 decades later, flew with irreversible hydraulic controls, a pulse Doppler radar, a training syllabus that put pilots through 300 hours of air combat maneuvering before they ever joined a squadron, and an institutional memory that traced back to Korea. The through line from Kimpo to Kadena runs straight and unbroken. The Soviets learned too. The MiG-21 introduced hydraulic boosted controls in 1959. Too late for Korea. Too late for the 335 aircraft and their pilots who paid for the education. Captain Frederick Boots Blessow flew his 121st and final combat mission on October 3, 1952. The same morning, Fedorets fought his frozen stick over the Chongchon. Blessow had 9 confirmed kills. He crossed back over the Yalu heading south at 31,000 feet, throttled back to cruise, and felt the Sabre's controls answer every input with the same light, linear pressure they delivered on his first familiarization flight at Nellis 14 months earlier. The stick felt like an extension of his hand. It always had. He landed at Suwon, taxied to the line, shut down the engine, and sat in the cockpit for a full minute before climbing out. A crew chief asked him how the mission went. "Their airplane was faster. Ours was smarter.